Chapter 1 Ultimate Sacrifice. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Go, now. Matthew whispered. His wide-open eyes and tense facial muscles screamed urgency. Yet, he didn't need to hurry anyone off. Their entire group rushed forward the second he gave the signal. Their entire group. But Matthew. For a single second, he stood back. System miracle, he chanted in his thoughts, a look of desperation flashing in his eyes. My left lung, he added, closing his eyes. This entire interaction took less than a second. And without thought, Matthew picked up the pace and ran after his friends. Sacrifice accepted, the cold voice of the system washed through Matthew's mind. He felt no pain when his left lung vanished. His miracle system was fair. Even though half of his lungs just disappeared, his body didn't go into a state of shock. The miracle that followed would prevent any secondary damage related to his sacrifice. Miracle activated, the cold voice of the system rang in Matthew's ears. A sense of strength filled his flesh. All the pain and exhaustion of the last 2 weeks vanished on the spot. His fear gave way to the cold and composed calculation. He caught up to his group without anyone even noticing his late start. Here, he thought, grabbing up Nadia's hand as he rushed ahead. Damn, Matthew cursed under his breath when their group reached the corner. They are already here, he uttered through his teeth. The main school's corridor ahead was filled with zombies. Judging by the bigger physiques in the crowd, Matthew took notice, there are some evolved ones out there too. Their group didn't stop. The 5 of them were the last students of the 3G class that survived. Maybe others were hiding in a different part of the school. But with the entire place overrun by zombies and monsters, there was hardly any way to check that. Push through. Matthew shouted, tightening his fingers over Nadia's wrist. No matter what, I will get her out of here, he thought, steeling his resolve as he gripped his baseball bat. Kill, he shouted a second later when their group crashed right into the crowd of the zombies. Matthew swung his bat in all directions. His movements appeared frantic but were aimed at just pushing the zombies away instead of putting them down. The force behind his swings far exceeded the capability of his meager muscles, allowing for such a reckless tactic. We can make it through, Matthew thought when the first of his remaining companions got caught. A rotting hand emerged from the crowd and caught the poor man by his throat. A grab like that easily subdued the athletic classmate of Matthew. Before a second could pass, several mouths rushed to gnaw away at his flesh. In such a crowd, his muscles were of no use. No, we will make it through, Matthew changed the wording of his thoughts, pushing his reinforced self to the limits. 2 other classmates of his died to a single strike of an evolved monster. Out of the original 30.3, only 5 remained after 2 weeks of the siege. And right now, 3 of Matthew's friends disappeared as well. Just let me go. Nadia shouted, desperately attempting to free her fist. With her injured leg, she was nothing but a burden for him. Shut it. Matthew barked, too focused on dealing with the zombies to pay Nadia's protests any mind. A swing to the left. A swing to the right. Sidestep to dodge a projectile. Duck to avoid a slashing grab. A swing to the left, a swing to the right, sharp pain exploding in his arm when a zombie scratched it. And then. The world opened before the 2 of them. Matthew's eyes widened as he stumbled for a second. The bright light of the outside nearly blinded him. Then, before Matthew would lose his momentum, he leaned his body forward and lunged ahead. Leave me. Nadia shouted. Now that their usual roles have turned, she couldn't handle seeing Matthew do the same thing that she did for him over all those years. Just a little bit more, Matthew thought, ignoring the girl's cry altogether. The cube of the equipment shed was the light at the end of a tunnel. The one last spot that they could try after the fall of their previous hideout. Thankfully, the area between the school's main building and the shed was relatively empty. Their former stronghold fell because zombies and monsters alike would be drawn towards the living beings. Yet, the reason behind the doom of their former keep was also the source of this one in a million opportunity before them. One last chance at prolonging their lives, even if only for a little. Because at this point, Matthew had no real hopes for surviving. He just kept on running. And just like that, he burst through the half-open doors of the shed, instantly scanning the area in search of zombies. I don't have time for this, he thought, clenching his teeth as he turned around and pushed the doors shut. He then sacrificed his club to block the doors. The timer in the right upper corner of his vision was nearing its end. Wah! Nadia uttered a small, shocked shout when Matthew rushed to prop the doors with anything he could find. Thankfully, no zombie appeared anywhere in the shed while he was busy fortifying the entrance. Was it a part of the miracle? Matthew thought, finishing his task just as the effect of his system boost ran out. He slumped to the floor in extreme exhaustion, his back sliding down the barricade he had just finished. "We did it," Nida muttered, her face frozen in shock. "No," she shook her head and raised her deep, green eyes at Matthew's face. "You did it." A bullet of emotions shot through Matthew's heart. "Thank you," Nadia added, kneeling down and placing her hand on Matthew's cheek. She then lowered her head and rested her forehead against Matthew's. "Thank you," she whispered, tears appearing under her closed eyelids. She smells insane, Matthew thought, his consciousness hanging by a thin thread. His eyes went up a little as the girl's scent filled his nostrils. After a moment of massively increased emotions, this was the natural way for his body to react. After surviving a life-and-death situation, one would feel the need to root themselves into reality with intimacy. It was a bare instinct born from the times predating human civilization, supposed to pull the group together in danger. Still, Matthew thought, reaching out and wrapping his arm around the girl's back, pulling her into a light embrace. "We have close to no food. This place is already surrounded by the zombies," he thought, looking up at the window situated at the other end of the building. It was small, high up the wall, and enclosed by metal bars. "While they can't get in, we can't really get out either," Matthew thought, his mood worsening by the second. The equipment shed was the last place where they could run to. Given how the entire school was enclosed by a massive wall, it was surprisingly one of the safest places. Because right outside of the wall, there was an entire, highly populated city. If the things are so dire within the confines of the school, I don't even want to imagine how it is outside the walls, Matthew thought, relating a small, silent sigh. "In other words, we are fucked," Matthew added in his mind, wrapping his hands a bit tighter around the girl's soft frame. "We are fucked," Nida whispered right into Matthew's chest in which she buried her face. "Aren't we?" she added, her voice changing into a weird chuckle. "Is there really nothing more that I can do?" Matthew asked himself, his mind and body alike too tired to think and pay attention to the girl at the same time. An intense wave of regret exploded in his heart. He was the single system holder in the entire group of 15 that created the stronghold within the school 2 weeks ago. Every other system holder has long disappeared from the school, enjoying the apocalypse to its fullest. It was just a matter of bad luck. When Nadia went to look for Matthew right when the apocalypse started, they ended up stranded from the rest of their class. And when they returned, only the mob of this new, changed world was left for them to join. "No," Matthew suddenly muttered, shocked by an unexpected idea. "It's so obvious," he thought, unable to believe in his own stupidity. "How could I miss it for so long?" he asked himself, only to bite down on his lips. "No, it's not that," he thought, raising his face up and locking his blurry sight on the beams on the ceiling. "Matt," Nida whispered, the look on her face changing again. A look of worry replaced the distressed amusement formerly present in her eyes. "There is still one last thing that I can do," Matthew whispered, his face lighting up. His lips, formerly twisted in a grimace of stress and exhaustion, now relaxed and formed a gentle smile. "What are you talking about?" Nida leaned her head to the side, unsure of the meaning behind her old friend's words. Don't worry, Matthew said, pulling the girl back into his embrace. Everything will be okay, he added, caressing the back of Nadia's head. The girl shrugged in surprise before forcing her face up again. Nadia's eyes widened in shock, while her lips formed an uneasy smile. Are we finally going to? She asked, her expression filling with happiness and sort of relief. System miracle, Matthew thought, closing his eyes in peace. Do it? Nadia asked, her face filling with joy. My life. Sacrifice accepted. The ominous voice of his system was the last thing Matthew heard before his vision turned dark. Chapter 2. Did you bang her? You are listening at novelfull.audio. So? Peter asked, his lips forming a lascivious smile. Did you bang her? Matthew didn't move. His body was fully frozen in the memory that he saw. Matthew looked down at his very own self, sitting silently in his own place in the class. His desk was surrounded from all sides by the perverted trio. They were the menace of all the girls in the school. And for some weird reason, they decided to pick Matthew as the one to share their infamy. Why am I seeing this? Matthew asked himself, trying to look around. But he couldn't. His vision was stuck in a position and an angle that made the center of his back right in the middle of what he could see. Is this the side effect of the miracle? Matthew thought, trying to rationalize the situation. And then he spotted it. The one thing that had no right to appear in the vision he saw. A system's clock. This time, it consisted of 3 parts, each of which counted down to some sort of event. The first one was about to run off, with a single minute left. The second one still had an entire hour, while the last one had 2 hours left. Judging from the time, Matthew thought, looking at the clock hanging above the class blackboard. The second one is counting to the start of the apocalypse, he thought. What was the first and the last one counting towards, though? Matthew had no clue. Come on, guys, Matthew's body moved in the exact same way that he did a bit over 2 weeks ago. You know it's not like that. We have known each other since forever, he attempted to defend himself. That's all there is to it, I promise. Oh, how pathetic I was, Matthew thought, watching his past plight. The numbers on the first of the clocks continued to tick down. You know, I heard about a few, pretty effective ways to get a girl to the bed, Frank, the other of the group, whispered in a conspirational tone. That's perfect. Peter once again took the prim of the bullying. But if we share it with you, the first of the clocks only had 10 seconds left. Wait, if I recall the events correctly, Matthew thought, watching how the number continued to tick down with each passing second. You will have to share her with us too, Peter finished his unholy idea before licking his lips. This is a great chance for you. Adam, the third of the group, smiled viciously. With our help, you will be finally able to cast your V. card, he announced loudly, instantly bringing some stares from the nearby students. This fucker, Matthew thought, tightening his spiritual hands. 3 seconds left. So, how will it be? Peter asked again. Do you want to take her at the same time with us, or would you rather wait your turn? 3 things happened at once. The clock reached the end of its time. The doors to the class slammed open. Matthew's vision blurred before changing from a third to a first-person view. Matthew looked down at his hands. They lacked all the scars that he earned on the first day of the apocalypse. There was no innate exhaustion embedded deeply into his flesh and bones. He was just as fresh as he was before the apocalypse. I have a body of a weakling, Matthew thought. Decide, you little dipshit. Adam shouted out loud, annoyed by the lack of reaction from the preferred toy of the group. Get away from him, you filth, Nida spoke out from her position by the doors. Scram before I will make you, Matthew spoke out, calmly raising his face and looking at Peter's face. I only need to waste him for the others to run, he thought, clenching his hand into a fist. You fucking, Peter squeezed through his teeth when his eyes wandered off, right at Nadia's nearby figure. The black belt that she loosely kept on her shoulder reminded him of the reason why they never moved beyond words in their bullying. You better be grateful to your boyfriend. Peter sneered, refusing the pleasure of insulting Matthew one last time. If not for your papa, you would long be just a stain on the. Peter didn't finish his words. Matthew swung his shoulders sideways, burying his fist deep into his obnoxious classmate's stomach. You can insult me all you want, Matthew said in a cold voice, allowing the lifeless Peter to hang over his shoulder. But include Nida in it, and I will pluck your balls out, he added before shaking his shoulder and throwing the man down on the floor. Matt! Nadia shouted in a sudden panic when Matthew engaged his bully. Are you okay? She rushed forward only to grab Matt's arm and look at his face, all worried. Everything's okay, Matthew replied, unable to stop a smile from forming on his lips. Whether it's just a nice dream or not, I don't care, he thought, reaching with his hand and placing it on top of the girl's head. Nadia froze in place, unsure how to react. Right, Matthew suddenly reflected on himself. We weren't like that by this time, he thought, eager to pull his hand away. But he didn't do it right away. Unable to resist his desire, he rustled the girl's hair before gracing her with a kind smile. Ha! Nadia finally managed to utter a small shout of shock through her lips. Her eyes opened wide, displaying the beautiful, jade-like green of her pupils. How about we ditch the class? Matthew suddenly brought up a proposition. His eyes involuntarily moved towards the upper right corner of his vision. This can't be a system, he thought, desperately trying to figure out what was going on. We only received them after defeating the first zombie, and they didn't even appear in this world yet, he thought, trying to rationalize the situation. Yeah, Matthew refocused his eyes and looked right at Nadia's face. Her long, golden streaks coated her face as if some kind of jewelry. Matthew couldn't stop a gentle smile from forming on his lips. Tell me, Matthew muttered before raising his voice a little. Would you mind going on a small date with me right now? He asked. There is only one thing that's supposed to happen in an hour, he thought under the facade that he put on his face. And if my guess is correct, then I don't have any time to waste. Unaware of Matthew's thoughts, Nadia nearly jumped on the spot. She was a good student with good attendance and history with the teachers. Being one of the school's athletic champions, she could get away with a lot but rarely used that privilege. But when she heard Matthew's invitation, her eyes lit up with a shock mixed with excitement. Sure thing, she chirped. Her lips formed a slightly weird smile as if she couldn't handle all the emotions that erupted in her soul. And whatever this situation is, Matthew thought, bringing his hand back and grabbing Nadia's fingers, I will protect you. No matter what. Chapter 3 Making sure you are listening at novelfull.audio. How should I proceed? Matthew asked himself while pulling Nadia along. It was something that his former self would never dare to do. To grab and then hold a hand of a childhood friend. What was this kind of sacrilege? He wouldn't consider himself worthy of such luxury. But current Matthew was different. The 2 weeks of the apocalypse he went through changed him drastically. There is no time for shyness or hesitation, he thought, checking the second timer in the corner of his vision. Roughly 50 minutes remained. Nadia didn't seem to notice Matthew's mental state. She was too immersed in the joy of ditching lessons with her friend for that. Seeing her jump around like that, Matthew thought, overwhelmed with the challenges that waited ahead. Just gazing at this cheerful joy of his life was enough to lift his spirits. Still, I guess there is no other way, Matthew thought. He was guilty of never fully growing out of his delusional phase. Ever before the apocalypse, Matthew would imagine himself in different scenarios. One of which turned out to be a perfect plan for his current situation. I will either end up a hero or a mental case, Matthew thought before releasing a deep breath. The second he knew what exactly to do, a massive burden disappeared from his back. The two reached the first and most important point on their journey. The infirmary. "I'm sorry," Matthew turned his head to the girl. "Would you mind waiting here for a second?" he asked with a small, slightly uneasy smile. "Oh," Nadia jumped a little, forced out of her momentary daze. "Sure, no problem," she then replied, smiling from ear to ear. She is just too bright, Matthew thought, turning his eyes away from the glorious sight of Nadia's cheerful expression. He took a step. And then another. With every pace he made, he could feel the atmosphere changing. It wasn't a gift that he received from his former system. It was an instinct that only the survivors could develop. An innate feeling unlocked by those who balanced on the line between life and death. Matthew reached the doors. Its two wings both had a blurry plane of glass in their middle, allowing one to peek inside. While the image would be distorted, it was still enough for Matthew's purpose. "It's crowded," he thought. He then attempted to make out the rough shapes and then count people inside. Just like back then, he thought, backing away from the door. He then rested his back against the wall. Yet, before his eyes could fully rest, Matthew caught a glimpse of a box. The treasure of the world that would begin in less than an hour. A cheap box of commodities in the current world. No, Matthew bit his lips. Not yet. It's too risky to blow a fuse so early, he decided, turning his eyes away from the box of medicinal supplies hanging on the wall of the infirmary. He froze in place for a moment. Even though Matthew already knew the exact path he had to take, he still required a moment to sort his thoughts out. Because what he just saw basically confirmed his worries. The apocalypse wasn't just a hyper-realistic dream. The clock in the corner of his vision wasn't some kind of illusion or hallucination. For now, everything checked out. I really traveled back in time, he thought, taking deep breaths to calm himself down. The situation calls for the desperate measures, Matthew thought, closing his eyes. He then pushed his back against the wall, propelling himself forward and returning to Nadia's side. "Can I borrow your phone for a bit?" Matthew asked while approaching the girl. "Sure," Nadia turned her head sideways, giving Matthew a cute look before passing her cell. "Let's go," Matthew muttered, typing out a relatively short number on the phone. For a moment, the two of them continued to climb the school's stairs in silence. Nadia was simply happy to enjoy her time alone with Matthew. Matthew didn't have the luxury to think about anything but his current mission. They reached the second floor in no time. "One more stop," Matthew said, patting the girl's shoulder as he went ahead. Yet, after just a few steps, he suddenly stopped. He then pulled out his wallet and then grabbed a single, thin coin. "Come out," he thought, pushing the coin into a small gap between the glass cover of the fire equipment storage box and its frame. This box quality was just like the rest of the school. Shitty and too cheap to be of any use. But the fire axe hidden inside was of top quality. "I remember the guy who took it before," Matthew thought, recalling a certain bloody scene from the beginnings of the apocalypse. For some reason, this axe became a blessed weapon. Just some people would receive systems, some zombies would evolve, certain weapons and items, in general, would also become stronger than ever. "What are you doing?" Nadia finally noticed a reason for concern and asked. "Just wait a second," Matthew replied, pulling the weapon out. It was a sturdy piece of equipment designed to break walls and doors alike. And in the near future, it will get some nasty abilities, Matthew thought before approaching the girl. This was the one decision that made him freeze before. Not the idea of blowing the whistle and starting the apocalypse several minutes prior to the world. It was the decision to reveal everything he knew to this one girl. She was the one that saved him on many different levels. She deserves to know, Matthew thought. But this decision forced a moment like the current one to appear. "Nadia, please," Matthew said in a firm voice. "Do you think I'm crazy?" he asked, looking the girl directly in the eyes. For a moment, Nadia stared down into Matt's eyes. She was startled and shocked, for sure, but she didn't outright refuse his request. Instead, she opened her eyes wide and looked for any signs of craziness in Matthew's pupils. "I don't think so," she muttered a moment later, lowering her eyes. "That's why I can only ask you for one thing," Matthew said, putting his weapon down on the floor before kneeling down. "For the next hour, I need you to trust me." "Matthew, what's going on?" Nadia asked. And she used Matt's full name while doing so. This only indicated how serious the girl became. "You won't believe me if I explain it with words," Matthew said, shaking his head. "I will explain everything as we go," he promised, only to lower his eyes. "But right now, we are on the clock," he said, his eyes glancing over to the corner of his vision. "And the time is really running out." Once again, Nadia simply stared down into Matthew's eyes. She then raised her hand and placed it on his cheek. Once again, the two of them froze at the moment. "Fine," Nadia whispered with her soft fingers. She kept looking into Matthew's eyes. "What are we going to do next, then?" she asked in a mesmerizing tone, pulling Matthew's mind into the abyss of her alluring lips. "We are going to visit the director of the school," Matthew forced himself to reply. He then picked up his axe, smiled cheerfully, and looked at the girl. "Shall we go?" "Yeah," Nadia nodded her head. "But are you going to tell me why?" she asked. "Why are we going to the director's office?" Nadia repeated her question a moment later. Matthew didn't refuse the answer. He just had to take a moment to sort his thoughts out to figure out the simplest way to explain it. "Right now, I just need another confirmation," he said, forcing himself to look ahead instead of scouting out Nadia's reaction. "Because I wish to be wrong from the very bottom of my heart." Chapter 4 Raising the Principal's Office. You are listening at novelfull.audio. How should I do it? Matthew thought. He gripped the handle of his weapon tighter, hesitation filling his mind. "I'm about to turn myself into a terrorist," he thought blankly as the reality of his plan started to dawn upon him. "Worst of all, I'm pulling her into all of this," he thought, glancing over at the girl's face. She managed to somehow keep her cool despite how weird the situation was. Her obedient and trusting silence was like a nail right down Matthew's heart. "But there is no other choice if I'm right," he protested in his thoughts as they neared the principal's office. Matthew stopped before the doors. "Everything that I did so far could still be fixed," he thought. An irrational hope appeared in his heart. "If it's just me going crazy, I can still stop it," he thought. The chance that it was nothing but a bad dream still existed. The talk in the corner of Matthew's vision continued to tick. Matthew took a deep breath. And then he knocked on the doors before intruding. The middle-aged man raised his eyes from the newspaper he was reading. "Who are you?" he asked, annoyed by the unannounced visitors. "Excuse me, sir," Matthew stepped forward, humbly bowing to the man. "I promise, I mean no harm," he added before pulling out the axe from behind his back. He then took a step forward to the right of the principal's seat. Matthew swung the weapon. The axe's blade dug deep into the wood of one of the principal's cabinets. Matt reached out with his hand into the destroyed piece of furniture. And there it was. The same pistol that Matt could recall from his earlier experience. The gun that gave his group hope back in his apocalyptic memories. But for now, what was most important, was that the details of Matthew's memories adhered to reality. This was the confirmation he needed. Because Matt had never been to the principal's office outside of that time in the apocalypse. Once again, Matthew turned his face to the principal. The man was so shocked he was stuck in a weird pose on his chair. "I apologize for the inconvenience," Matt bowed his head again as he picked up both the gun and the bullets. "What the hell is going on?" the principal muttered, glued to his chair. "I will be calling the police myself," Matthew informed, picking up the phone and showing the screen. The alarm number was already connecting. "Matt," Nadia muttered silently. Up to this point, she still believed. She still believed that there was a reason behind Matt's actions. She was simply too stunned to react and too lost in how to react. "Dispatcher," the voice on the phone rang. "What seems to be the issue?" This single line suddenly turned the atmosphere even tenser than it was before. If Matthew's attack at the principal's office and the act of stealing his gun wasn't serious enough, the voice from the phone now elevated it to another level. By announcing himself to the police, Matthew turned from a hooligan into a terrorist. "I will burn this whole place down," he shouted into the phone, moving his head away from the microphone. A phone. Matt sounded surprised for a second. "Give me that," he then shouted again before waiting for a second and ending the call. Cough, Matthew cleared his throat and shook his head. He then looked at the principal and the girl. "I'm sorry for that little act. Once again, I will surrender myself to the police on the first moment notice," he said. For a second, Matthew closed his eyes. He had to collect his thoughts. "Matt. Please, tell me," Nadia pulled on Matthew's sleeve, desperately trying to gain his attention. "What's going on?" she cried out in a low voice, scared shitless. She didn't care about his actions or his gun. Nadia was worried about losing her dear friend. "I still find it hard to believe. But so far, every single thing that I check does check out," Matthew said, lowering his hands on his face and taking a deep breath. "My one and only aim are to bring heavily armed police to a certain point in the school," he explained in a single breath. The room tensed up even further. "Wait, the infirmary." Nadia quickly caught on. She wasn't one of the top students just for show. "That's right," Matthew nodded his head only to glance over at the phone screen. "Call made 2 minutes ago," he thought, calculating everything in his mind. "I guess we should go, now," he decided, raising his eyes and looking at the girl. "Principal, once again, I'm sorry for the entire commotion," I said, lowering my head in apology. "I wish with all my heart for my fears to prove wrong. I won't hurt anyone, and I will pay back for the damage I made," he added before raising his head again. "But for now, I need to go," Matthew said, grabbing Nadia's hand and pulling her out of the room. "To that end, I hope you will remain in your office," Matt added in a low tone before closing the doors. "Matt, what the hell is going on?" Nadia finally took a stance, refusing to just tag along. "What's wrong with the infirmary?" she asked, pressing the issue she figured out earlier. "There is a reason why I only looked through the window," Matthew replied, turning his eyes away. Nadia's face turned white as her eyes widened in terror. "What's wrong with the infirmary, Matt?" Nadia asked, her eyes tearing up. She then raised her hand and placed it on Matthew's cheek. "What did you do?" she whispered through her tears. "I didn't do anything," Matthew shook his head and closed his eyes. "But I know something very bad is about to happen in less than an hour," he added, placing his hands on Nadia's back. For a moment, Matthew simply hugged the girl. It was a soul-refreshing moment of the past 2 weeks. The one moment of relief. "What are you going to do next, then?" Nadia asked, wiping the tears off her face as she looked deep into Matthew's eyes. "I'm going to invite one of them inside," Matthew said, regaining his composure. "I need to have an officer to witness what I believe is about to happen." Chapter 5 Playing the Terrorist Act. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Matthew walked to the bottom floor of the building. Nadia followed silently behind him, unable to form a single cohesive thought. "What's going on?" she whispered, once again trying to pry the truth from my lips. "If I tell you now, you won't believe me," Matthew replied, shaking his head. "Soon, you will understand everything. But for now, we need to wait," he explained as best as he could. "What am I supposed to tell her?" Matthew thought, despairing over the situation. Any attempt at boldly declaring what was about to come would fester one question. "How did you know?" Matthew thought, his face turning dark at the mere idea of such a thing. If he were to become someone believed to be behind the apocalypse, his life would be short and eventful. Are we going to get out of this? Somehow. Nadia asked as the two of them stopped in the same place they saw at the very beginning. She rested her back against the wall before plummeting down. Why can't you just, Nadia attempted to say something, only for the school to fill with the noise of sirens. Matthew's plan was quickly coming to fruition. Not a second too early, he thought, pulling out his phone again. Matthew then turned his head to the girl and lowered it in apology. I will explain everything in a few moments when the police officer arrives, he said before typing the short number. Dispatcher, the voice rang through the phone. I wish to talk with the negotiator, Matthew announced calmly. He could hear the sirens. Meaning the police were already there. And in the current era, the enforcement would do everything to stop a problem like this one. I hope so fucking much I'm all wrong, Matthew thought before steeling himself for what was to come. For a few moments, the dispatcher turned silent. Then, the voice changed. Here, a voice of a tired, old man appeared on the phone. I don't recognize him, Matthew thought. Some figures made a name for themselves in the first few days of the apocalypse. But this voice didn't belong to any of them. To start it off, the man got tired of waiting and initiated the discussion. Nadia trembled by Matthew's side, the consequences of her friend's actions finally dawning on her. What the hell do you want? The negotiator asked lazily. Drop the entire hero pretense and just tell me what do you want, he added after another moment of silence. First, I'm extremely sorry for this entire disturbance, Matthew spoke calmly to the phone. Nadia froze, surprised by the unexpected development. By this point, she appeared to lose all hope in her friend. To make sure we are on the same page, Matthew continued, I didn't hurt anyone. Outside of a single cabinet, I didn't hurt anything at all. And I would be the happiest man in the world to keep it that way, Matthew stated. What? Nadia kept silent, too scared to interrupt the call. But the expression on her face was clear. But in the off chance that I'm right, Matthew suddenly added, his tone changing a little. The difference even reflected on his face as he closed his eyes in peace. Then I need one of your men to witness it firsthand, Matthew added. For a moment, the negotiator turned silent. Then, a faint voice reached out to the two of them through the phone. You saw that too. Matthew's heart stopped beating for a moment. What, he thought, his eyes opening wide. He then shook his head and took a deep breath. Remember, he said to the phone. I need one, fully armed man. If nothing happens in 20 minutes, I walk out in cuffs, Matthew spoke to the phone, his face calming down. But if I'm right, then you will understand my need for a heavily armed team in this place, Matthew added, a small smile appearing on his lips. I will be waiting by the infirmary, he threw before cutting the call. Is this all? Nadia muttered under her nose, all necessary? She asked, raising her eyes despite keeping her face low. Oh dear, Matthew whispered as he closed his eyes. I hope not with all my heart, he added before reaching out and patting Nadia's head. Whatever will be the case, I will make sure you will be safe, he said, more to himself than to the girl. Safe. Nadia raised her eyes again. Safe from what? The look on her face started to change. As she learned more and more about the situation, she slowly managed to piece together some sort of explanation. Whether it was right or not, Matthew had no idea. But he could tell that Nadia's mood had changed. Just wait for a moment, Matthew smiled in response. Once the officer arrives, I will explain everything, he said before sharply turning his head to the side. The sound of footsteps reached Matthew's ears. So he is here, already, he thought, turning his face towards the entrance of the corridor. The sheriff of the town. Not in the direct meaning of this word. This man was just your regular cop. But his disposition and popularity forced this moniker upon him. I guess the cowboy's hat did its part in this man's image, Matthew thought. So, the man asked, his arms crossed over his muscular chest. What do you need me here for? He asked, puzzled by Matthew's calm demeanor. 20 minutes of your time, Matthew replied bluntly before gracing the man with his smile. If nothing happens until then, I will surrender. And if something happens, Matthew stopped, turning his eyes and directing them towards the opposite side of the corridor. Both his firearm and the fire axe rested against the wall. Each of them is at least 2 meters away from Matthew. Okay, the man muttered. The dissonance between his expectations and reality boiled in the policeman's eyes. For now, though, Matthew glanced over at Nida before revealing a small, sad smile. I guess you need to hear what I saw, Matthew muttered under his nose, only to raise his head and look at the officer's face. Roughly half an hour ago, I died. Chapter 6 Calm Before the Storm. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Kid, what's your problem? The officer asked, putting a weird grin on his face. It was a look of a man who just can't deal with the teenagers. Roughly half an hour ago, I died, Matthew repeated his words, looking the man directly in the eyes. For a moment, the two entered a standoff. It was a completely random occurrence when their eyes met. For the next few moments, the two of them simply stared each other down, each more desperate not to blink. With all my heart, I hope it was just a bad dream, Matthew said, plummeting down to the ground and resting his face in his hands. But if it's not, I need to do everything in my power to survive what's about to come, he added in a silent voice. So you just want someone to hold your hand and tell you everything will be okay? The officer asked, an uneasy expression forming on his lips. Who is this guy? Matthew thought, rolling his eyes. I know I asked for a veteran, but still, how could they send someone so clueless, he despaired. Since when calling someone out like that was a method of dealing with a potential terrorist? Or is it the fact that I let go of my guns that makes him so relaxed? Matthew thought before shooing all those useless thoughts aside. It doesn't matter, he thought, moving his eyes on Nadia's face. In 20.7 minutes from now, I believe something will happen in that infirmary, Matthew said, finally ready to explain what was going on. Did you? Nadia whispered, her face tense as she thought about something. See something? She asked, raising her eyes on Matthew's face. I saw a lot, Matthew quickly replied. And the worst of it all is that I can still see something that I shouldn't see, he added, glancing over to the clock in the corner of his vision. It continued to tick the time away. 1 second at a time. But it never stopped. Nadia turned silent. She was likely too confused to say something. And no, Matthew said, turning his head back towards the officer. If it's holding hands that I needed, I could just ask my dear friend, he said, nodding his chin towards the girl. What I need is someone good enough with the gun to cover my back, he added in a half-voice, turning his eyes away. The officer's face tensed up when he realized the meaning behind those words. What's going to happen in 20.7 minutes? He asked coldly. His hand hovered near his holster, where his personal weapon could be seen just as Matthew requested. It has nothing to do with me, Matthew raised his hands before slowly turning his face towards the infirmary. Once again. I died half an hour ago, he put a huge emphasis on those words. I have no idea how, but I made it back. Back in time. Matthew suddenly asked, covering his face with his hands. So you really need someone to just watch over those doors for a short while? The officer asked. His voice softened a little. And then you will be happy, right? He added. I certainly do hope so, Matthew nodded his head, turning his hand towards the doors. But before everything starts, remember a few things, he suddenly announced. First, you won't turn from a single scratch. It takes quite a lot of their body juices to enter your system for you to turn, Matthew said in a tone of someone schooling a youngster about the basics of a craft. We have an hour once it starts to, Matthew hesitated. Using kill right now. It wouldn't be the greatest idea, he noticed. To do what? The officer asked. Even though he appeared to be relaxed, the look in his eyes proved he didn't just let Matthew's words by his ears. To clean as many of them, Matthew finished before turning his eyes back towards the nearby doors. All we had was just a guess. He hesitated for a moment before biting his lips down. But it seems that the progress during the first hour decides who will receive a system. He then randomly dropped another bomb. A system, the officer repeated the word impassively, clearly confused about the sudden turn of the story. Wait, are you telling me? Nadia suddenly turned energetic. Her interests aligned her to understand the term in its proper way. But the picture that such term usually invoked. Yeah, Matthew nodded his head. The last time, I got a miracle system, he explained without hiding anything. Basically, I could offer something in order to invoke a miracle, he said. What are you even talking about, guys? The officer couldn't hold it for long. He couldn't understand the topic, which didn't sit well with his desire to control the situation. I'm sorry for the jargon. Matthew turned his eyes towards the man before casting a quick look at the clock. It will all start in 10 minutes, he noticed before refocusing his eyes on the man. If I'm correct, then in 10 minutes, the zombie apocalypse will start, Matthew explained bluntly. It's just a guess, but the more zombies we destroy, Matt was careful to avoid the wrong word, the better system we will receive, he explained as simply as he could. A system is basically a cheat, Nadia explained. She was well versed in all sorts of literature. An overpowered ability that makes one stronger than the others, she elaborated a little before raising her thumb to her lips. No, that's not it, she muttered, biting down on her nail. It's a way for the character to survive the situation. A power. Up in a fantasy world, she fixed her own mistake. Again, what do you want to do with those zombies? The officer interrupted the deep explanation of the term. A relaxed smile on his face, felt weird. As if there was a second meaning behind it. Shit, Matthew thought, realizing his mistake. Could you perhaps be interested in killing 6 citizens and students of this school? The man asked, openly laying his hand down at the handle of his weapon. Matthew raised his hands in reply. I won't reach for the weapon unless it is too late, he promised, a knowing smile blossoming on his lips. And what do you mean by too late? The officer asked, undoing the strap on the holster. Let's see, Matthew smiled, completely relaxed in the situation. When this corridor will get overrun with zombies, and you will be desperately screaming for reinforcements. Fair enough. Matthew asked with a smile of a naive child on his face. Fair enough, the officer sighed. He seemed to realize what kind of situation they were talking about. Just keep those points in mind, Matthew added, holding back a small giggle. Also, I hope your radio is working, he added, turning his eyes towards the doors. What do you mean by that? The man asked, interested by the sudden question. It would be for the best if the rest of your people prepared to rush to this place, Matthew replied, turning his face towards the man. The sooner you make the decision, the more time they will have to come and help us contain it, Matthew added before shaking his shoulders. And if nothing happens? The officer asked, unwilling to drop the realistic approach to the topic. Then I will surrender, pay back the damage, and openly apologize to every officer that had to stay late in work because of my actions, Matthew replied with a small smirk. Just kidding. I will most likely go serve my time. That or a mental hospital, he added. Matt. Nadia screamed out a little. The look of worry on her face made Matthew's heart tremble. This was the cost of his actions that he didn't foresee. If it all turned out to be a mere hallucination, a bad dream, and even worse decisions, he would bring Nadia a lot of grief. Wait, what? Matthew suddenly shrugged. What am I even thinking about? He asked himself, puzzled by the sudden nostalgia. Between making her sad and having her torn apart by the zombies, he thought, his entire body tensing up. Matt glanced over at the clock. 2 minutes left, Matthew muttered, turning his face towards the officer. It will be a good moment to ask your men to prepare, he advised. The officer raised one of his eyebrows. For a moment, there was only silence. "Come in," the man finally raised his voice, his radio by his mouth. "Yeah." Matthew heard a silent reply on the other side. "Guys, the matter is handled. No killed or injured," he added before taking a long glance at Matt's determined face. "Just in case, get ready for a brutal fight in a minute," he added before lowering the radio back on his chest. "Thank you," Matthew replied, refusing to move his eyes away from the infirmary doors. The clock reached the breaking point. With all the minutes gone, it could only count the last remaining seconds. "Nadia," Matthew muttered, turning his head towards the girl. Whatever happens," Matt cringed at his own words. "What, am I in some drama movie for teens now?" he asked himself before rolling his eyes. "I will keep you safe," he whispered, reaching the peaks of courage he didn't achieve back in the apocalypse. The seconds ticked down. "If we get the chance, we should snatch the medkit from the infirmary," Matthew said right as the second clock reached its final second. Chapter 7 Agile Zombies. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The time ran out. The clock struck 0. Matthew's heart beat faster, only to slow down. Instead of getting excited, his mind turned completely empty, ready to adapt to any and all possible situation from now on. The time came. And went away. The corridor remained as silent as one could imagine. In the middle of a massive high school, that is. Thank God. A visible wave of relief washed off Matthew's entire self. He plummeted down on the ground, only supporting his upper body with his arms. "Is that all this was about?" the officer asked. The man still kept his hand on his gun's holster. But he saw Matthew's reactions. And they were genuine. "I guess so," Matthew replied with an uneasy smile. But as much as he wanted, he couldn't relax. Because while the second clock stopped, the third one hidden in the corner of Matthew's vision continued to tick. A wave of uneasiness filled Matthew's eyes. He then shook his head. "So, do you want to cuff me now?" he asked, relaxing a bit. Thank fucking God, he thought, all the strength leaving his arms. "Now that I think about it," the officer hesitated for a moment. "You did say that you only destroyed a cabinet, didn't you?" "Huh?" Matt couldn't understand what the officer was talking about. He understood the words but not the meaning behind the question. "Yeah, I only did it to confirm if what I saw in my dream adhered to the reality," Matthew explained before releasing a deep sigh. The entire situation tired him down to no end. "I guess this matter didn't really explode in the media yet. But, since there was no real harm attempted, I could put in a good word." The man scratched his cheek, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He was a veteran officer of the prevention group. Not someone educated to deal with adolescents. But Matthew didn't smile. Instead, his face froze. Those sounds, he thought, listening into the lowest frequency that he could hear. His eyes opened up wide. "Now I remember," he thought, desperately shifting his attention to the girl beside him. "Can you hear those low sounds?" he asked, grabbing the girl by her shoulders. It was a very low, barely noticeable beating. A rhythmic sound that one had to really focus on hearing. Nadia's face turned still for a moment before her pupils widened as she looked at Matthew's face. "What are those?" she asked, shocked to her wits. "What are you talking about, guys?" the officer asked, puzzled by the sudden change. "You won't be able to hear it," Matthew rushed up, alerting the man in the process. "Don't worry," Matt added, seeing the nervous reaction of the man. "We don't have the time for that, but you can grab any young student in the school right now," Matthew pointed out as his expression sank. "To do what?" the officer asked, clearly on edge. "To ask if they hear a low, rhythmic sound beating at the very edge of their consciousness," Matthew explained before focusing his eyes on the infirmary's door. The relative silence of before was now nowhere to be seen. In the short moment when Matt's idea occupied their attention, the infirmary turned into a mess. "What is going on?" the officer started, moving his eyes on the care room's doors. "It's starting," Matthew replied, his face turning pale. He involuntarily took a step back, only to move his eyes on the girl behind him. No, he thought, challenged by the reality. With every second, Matt could recall a new harbinger of what was about to come. The air in the school tensed up. The beating in his ears got louder. It was exactly the same symptoms that he had experienced 2 weeks prior. "Stay behind me at all times," Matthew ordered, shielding the girl with his own body. "The first few moments will be the worst," he thought, glancing over at the officer. It would rest on the policeman's right call for the desperate plan to succeed. And that was a variable Matthew couldn't allow. "What's going on?" Nadia muttered silently, grabbing herself by her head. Matthew's heart exploded. For her symptoms to appear so strongly, his soul broke apart. She not only would be forced to witness the apocalypse, but she would also turn into an evolved monster herself. What the fuck did change? Matthew thought, desperate to find a way to change this unfair fate. Wait, he suddenly thought, as a wild idea appeared in his mind. The doors to the infirmary started to shake, indicating the scale of the hell inside. "What the fuck is going on?" the officer screamed out, pulling out his gun. Matthew turned his head to the man. "This is the best moment to call for the backup," he said calmly, looking the officer directly in the eye. And the man hesitated. He was a veteran of a police elite squad and a former military as well. And he could recognize the eyes of someone who went through hell and back. How the hell could a kid, he thought, only to glance over towards the doors. Something wrong is really going on, he thought, tightening his grasp over his handgun. "Guys, come on in," the officer muttered. He didn't bother turning the radio on. Which meant that his team outside heard every last word. Just like expected, Matthew smiled, reassured by the development. And then, just like that, it happened. The doors burst open. And then a single student walked out of place. He was grabbing his own arm, but even his entire hand couldn't stop the copious amounts of blood that trickled between his fingers. Poor guy, Matthew thought, unable to do anything for the man. With how little I know, stepping inside that room was a suicide, he thought. The man that walked out wasn't turned yet. Which meant he was likely the first casualty of the apocalypse. Poor guy, Matthew thought, steeling his resolve. But a lucky one too, he added before glancing over at the officer. "If you want me to grab my weapons, now it's the time," Matthew announced. Even though he wanted to appear cheeky, he couldn't hide the worry on his face. "There is no need for you to do anything," the man said when the footsteps reached their ears. He fixed his composure and aimed his gun at the door. "It will take about 10 more seconds before he turns," Matthew said without a care in the world. "You should watch it to make up your mind," he added as he turned his eyes to the girl. "I will save you, don't worry," he said, his worry exploding when he saw Nadia's cloudy eyes. "It's not good," Matt bit down on his lips. "If I managed to save her the last time by obtaining the miracle system, then what can I do now?" he asked himself. This was the hurdle that he didn't expect. When he received his miracle system 2 weeks ago, Matthew wished to reunite with the girl. But, outside of his last wish, this one cost him the most. And then, just like one would expect from a miracle, Nadia just happened to appear beside him a moment later. It was this one desperate wish that gave him enough strength to survive. Even if it was for 2 more weeks. At the current rate, she will turn in about an hour, Matthew thought, helping the girl down as she could no longer stand. "What wrong with her?" the officer asked, turning his eyes away from the door for a moment. The rest of the police squad appeared in the corridor, all heavily armed. "That's a good sign," Matthew thought, smiling gently at sight. Then, he turned his face towards the doors. It should start about now, he thought. Then the wall crumbled. Pushed by the force of tens of zombies, the entire section of the wall around the infirmary's doors collapsed. And a single second later, the corridor filled with agile zombies. The rarest kind of this species. Within the 2 weeks that Matt survived before, they only appeared right at the beginning. Outside of their speed, they were no different from normal zombies. And in the time he spent hiding with Nadia away in their makeshift fortress, Matthew formulated a guess. Matt smiled as he walked towards his weapons. "Remember, guys," he shouted over, noticing the shock in the eyes of the arriving men. They heard every last word of his through the officer's active radio. So to a degree, they knew what was likely to be the emergency here. But anticipating something and experiencing it firsthand. "The more you get, the stronger your system should be," Matt said, hiding his gun in his pocket and pulling out the fire axe. "And if we contain them here, we might be able to secure the entire school." "What is this guy talking about?" one of the policemen muttered before moving their eyes on the mass of approaching zombies. They were agile, but within the zombie meaning of this word. The officers still had some time to decide on the course of action. "Stop right there," the man that I requested before suddenly shouted, pointing his gun at the zombies. Obviously, not a single one listened. Instead, his voice only attracted their attention, making the entire wave rush right at the man. Ting! Matthew stood too close to the gun. His hearing in his left ear went off instantly. "Shoot them down," the officer said, commanding his entire unit. Matthew looked towards the zombies, preparing himself for the massacre. And then he saw just what made that officer shoot so fast. The nurse's corpse walked towards them with half of her ribs area gone. The officer has seen war. And he knew that people without half of their torso couldn't walk up straight. It was this one sight that made him shoot. "Leave some for me," Matthew shouted, rushing into the fray before the rest of the officers could start shooting. This was the only way to save Nadia from turning. If I could save her back then, that means she likely won't turn before the first hour, Matthew thought, swinging his axe above his neck as he rushed forward. That means I need a system capable of saving her, he thought. He never learned any facts about what the systems were. It was something that just appeared. The idea that those who killed zombies in the first hour would receive a system was a stretch. A simple attempt at explaining the unknown by mixing the stories up and finding common points. There was a chance it was all for naught already, completely pointless. But I'm not going to give up, Matthew thought, reaching the corpse of the nurse. It used to be a lovely and kind woman, although legendary for her singlehood. And now, even with a bullet in where her heart should be, she continued to walk towards the humans. The key to fighting zombies lay in stopping them from reaching you. As long as a human could remain in their top shape, they could easily fight off entire droves of zombies. Matthew cut the zombie's head away but didn't bother to stomp it down. Unable to move around, the zombie was now rendered completely useless. But it was only the beginning. Matt looked up towards the wave of former students sleazing out of the hole and rushing all towards him. "Once we thin them out, make sure to take some down in close quarters," Matthew shouted, raising his weapon above his head. "It's only a guess, but it might help." Chapter 8 Insufficient. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Matt buried his axe deep into the head of the zombie nearest to him. "Fuck," he cursed, desperately pulling at the handle, only to realize it was too late. His desperate swing aimed at killing the one enemy that threatened him ended up costing Matt his weapon. "Duck," the officer shouted, pressing the trigger his weapon a second later. There was no sign of hesitation in his movements and actions either. The sight of those half-eaten bodies was enough to turn this calm law enforcer into a merciless veteran. "Thanks," I threw in the air, squatting and reaching out for my weapon. That man's shot gave me just enough time to grab my tool of the massacre. There is no end to them, Matthew thought, raising his eyes at the approaching enemies. The zombies in the opening wave were surprisingly swift, but still within the scope of what one would expect from a zombie. There were limits to how fast a half-eaten body could move. Matt took a glance to update himself on the situation. He then glanced over at Nadia. Following that, a long wrinkle appeared on his forehead. Why is she infected? Matthew asked himself, unable to fully embrace the seriousness of the situation. What should I do? Will my system be able to save her? A flurry of questions exploded in Matthew's mind. No use, there is only one thing I can do right now, he thought as he raised his eyes on the approaching zombies. There were two ways of saving Nadia. I can either rely on the system or force summon a merchant, Matt thought, recalling the rules he learned about the apocalypse world in his past life. But this isn't going to be easy, he thought, readying himself for yet another fight. Patrick, was he? Matthew thought, glancing at the bloodied face. A senior from 1 year up. A vibrant person in the music circle. And now but a headless zombie left to rot away. Matthew then swung his axe again and then again. The 2 weeks of intense and constant combat ingrained themselves into his flesh, allowing Matt to proceed relatively calmly. At the current rate, Matt thought, using the opening in the fight to glance over at the girl. Nadia's forehead was already turning bright pink, coated with fat drops of her sweat. Her breathing was hard, and her eyes half-closed. Matt then looked over to the clock in the corner of his vision. She won't last until the first wave, he realized, his fingers tightening into fists on their own. It meant a simple thing. It didn't matter whether his system could prevent Nadia from turning anymore. Because she would likely succumb to the virus before Matt would receive his system in the first place. A wave of powerlessness surged through Matt's veins, freezing his body on the spot. And then, the fire behind his eyes reignited. If I can't use the system, then I will force summon this damned merchant, he decided on the spot, gripping the handle of his weapon tighter. Whoever was behind this apocalypse sure thought things through. By killing zombies, one could extract a life's core from their brains. In the world changed by the apocalypse, those cores turned into the unified value for everything. Or rather, that's what Matt believed would happen if he lasted any further into the post-apocalyptic world. Yet, there was one thing that he knew for sure. One could forcefully summon a merchant by gathering 100 of said cores. In the world of the apocalypse, those who worked hard would receive bountiful rewards. By exchanging further cores with the merchant, one could obtain basically anything they could desire, all for a fair price. I will need about 150, Matt thought, focusing his eyes on the nearest group of zombies. But just as he was about to rush it, a series of shots shook the air in the corridor. The backup force of the anti-terrorists finally joined the battle. The battle went on quickly from that point on. Despite being slightly stronger than the normal zombies, they still didn't pose any real danger to a prepared defense. For now, Matthew's group was safe. Ugh! Matthew moaned from exhaustion when he brought his axe down on the head of the last of the zombies. With several minutes left on the clock, he still had some time to help Nadia out. But he could only stand his ground, looking down at all the cores that he managed to gather. With the swift zombies all defeated, new zombies would only appear during the first wave. The first wave would start once Matt's third clock reached its time. In other words, with all the zombies gone, no more would appear before after Nadia would turn. And in Matt's palms, there were only 90.5 stones. Chapter 9 Wives System. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Is that all of them? The police officer approached Matt shortly after he finished the job. For now, yeah, Matt replied, turning around and ignoring the man. There is no way I will waste my time talking with him right now, Matt thought, falling to his knees by Nadia's side. He then picked up her delicate fingers, only to feel just how hot she was. Are you here? Matthew asked gently, reaching out and wiping the sweat off the girl's forehead. Her half-opened eyes appeared to be asleep as if she was no longer aware of her surroundings. She is worse than it expected, Matthew thought, carefully inspecting Nadia's face and eyes. Without 100 cores, Matt couldn't summon a merchant. And even if he did, he would have no cores left for the medicine. Nadia, Matthew brought his lips closer to the girl's ear, gently pushing her hair out of the way as he whispered. I need you to hold on for 10 more minutes, Matthew said before glancing over at the clock in the corner of his vision. Only 5 minutes left before the first wave would truly begin. Hey, is that all? Or is something else going to happen? The officer from before shouted, forcing Matt out of his daze. In 5 minutes, a small percent of the population will turn into normal zombies, Matt said before turning his eyes back to the girl. Nadia, I need you to promise me this, Matthew then whispered right into the girl's ear. Promise me that you will hold on for 10 more minutes, he continued to press the girl. How could I refuse, Nadia whispered, using as little air as she could to voice her words. When you are asking so sweetly, she muttered, moving her hand around in an attempt to find Matthew's face. She is losing her sight already. Matthew thought, his body tensing up. The only reason why he tried so hard right now was to keep Nadia safe by his side. But as it turned out, no matter what he would do, it would be all pointless. Because losing one's sight was the last symptom before one would turn. I don't give a fuck anymore, Matthew thought, bringing the girl closer in his arms. I promise, Nadia muttered, clearly having trouble voicing her thoughts. I will hold, she added before suddenly sucking on the air as if she was drowning. Matt couldn't do anything but cuddle Nadia's shaking body in his arms. The clock reached 0. The first wave started. Man, speak to me, the police officer attempted to force Matt out of his daze but to no avail. System activated, wives leveling system awakens, pick your wife. 3 windows appeared one by one, right before Matt's eyes. He then looked around to check on the situation. No police officer appeared to have any trouble, meaning none of them would turn during the first wave. And that left Nadia in Matt's arms. Nadia, do you hear me? Matthew probed, once again clearing the girl's forehead from sweat. He then gulped down his saliva before leaning over the girl's ear, as close as if he wanted to nibble on it. Nadia, will you be my wife? Matthew asked. But Nadia could no longer speak. Then, her lips moved a little. No voice came from between them, but they clearly formed 2 different figures. Wife accepted, the system announced in its usual, cold voice. And then, all the windows disappeared from Matt's vision, forcefully returning him to reality. Matt's eyes instantly moved down to the girl in his arms. Nadia's temperature fell down, signaling that the sudden appearance of the system worked. Thank God, Matt thought, feeling the stable rhythm in which the girl started to breathe. Whatever his system did, it clearly worked. But I doubt this will be all, Matt thought, caressing Nadia's cheek for a while as he dealt with an overwhelming wave of relief. She is so fragile, Matt thought, gently hugging the girl into his chest. Normally she would be the one to protect him. Yet, right now, she felt like a small, little puppy when confined to Matt's arms. Whatever will happen from now on, I need to protect her, Matt thought to himself, resting his chin on the top of the girl's head. Keeping her enclosed in his grasp like that was the only medicine for his anxiety-torn heart. Listen to me, you little fuck, the officer finally couldn't hold himself back anymore. He shouted so loud that Matthew had no other choice but to raise his head. What the hell is going to happen next? Now that his attention was back in reality, Matthew noticed the low, guttural sound coming from the staircase to their back. The zombies were already nearing this place. And she didn't turn, Matthew thought, looking down at the girl in his arms. She was sleeping, clearly exhausted to no end by the attack of the virus. I can't stop yet, Matthew told himself, laying the girl down on the floor. He then raised his eyes on the officer. Right now, we need to obtain as many life cores as we can, he said, gathering himself up and taking hold of his axe. Those stones you collected before, the negotiator asked, leaning his head to the side while sending a glance towards the zombies approaching from the side. That's right, Matthew nodded his head, fixing his hold over his weapon. For 100, we can summon a merchant. But we need 1,000 to establish a fortress, he said, taking a step towards the incoming wave. Now that Nadia was relatively safe, Matthew no longer needed to hold back. Contrary to that, he had to secure his position as soon as possible. Only by gaining access to a merchant and farming the cores could Matt hope to establish himself in this new, changed world. Whatever it will take, I will do, Matt thought, locking his eyes on the nearest zombie. No matter what, I will keep Nadia safe. Chapter 10 Matthew's announcement. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 1,000 to establish a fortress. But we need to summon at least 3 merchants first, Matthew thought, trying to fight his confusion by organizing his thoughts. But that's all a song of the future. For now, we need a merchant, he thought, reflecting on his own state of mind. How long do we have? The officer asked, raising his hand to stop the rest of the group from approaching. The scene of the carnage just a few feet away from us was awful enough from a distance. There was no point in forcing those good men to endure this gruesome sight for no reason. Several minutes, Matthew replied, only to cast a quick glance into the corner of his vision. 6 minutes to be exact, he then added, making his answer more precise. What should we expect? The man asked, pulling out the mag of his gun and glancing down to check his ammunition. And how the heck could I know that? Matthew asked, opening his eyes wide in a faked shock. I had my hands full trying to escape those agile ones. I only ended up killing one by accident, he revealed, only to spread his arms wide. For all I know, this school might be safe now that the agile ones are gone. But it's also possible that the first wave of real zombies will begin soon. That's right, Matthew thought grimly. Even by surviving 2 weeks into the apocalypse, I still know shit, he thought as he bit down on his lip in frustration. Matt. Nadia muttered softly through her sleep. Her eyelids tightened only to relax as a wide, comfortable smile emerged on her lips. I wonder what is she dreaming about, Matthew thought, bringing his hand up to Nadia's cheek and caressing it gently. Anyway, what we need, right now is a merchant, Matthew said as he stood up and looked around. But we are in a really bad spot to think about it, he added, raising his hand to his face only to bit down on the nail of his thumb. A momentary grief took over Matthew's face, only for him to shake his head and then look up at the police officers. There is one thing that we can do, he stated, only to avert his eyes a moment later. But I need to ask you first, he added, his voice faltering. Because Matthew was aware of what was the true meaning of what he was about to ask. Do you want to operate with efficiency or morals in mind? Matthew asked. Right now, the support of the armed forces is the best guarantee for safety, Matthew thought, taking a deep breath. Even if their strength fades away against the evolved monsters, they could offer me a kickstart into the economy of the new world, he thought. In order to make a living, there was only one path worth pursuing. And it was collecting the life stones of the zombies and monsters alike only to then trade them away with the merchants. I only had the opportunity to visit a merchant once, Matthew recalled the short memory from his previous life. Back then, he only had a few stones on himself, courtesy of defending their fortress from the incoming zombies. With the favorable terrain and a small help from his former system, he managed to collect a small sum. To think that this would be one of my worst memories, Matthew thought, lowering his eyes and taking a 5-second period of silence to mourn his idiotic decisions from before. Back then, he wasted his entire fortune to heal the effects of the last sacrifice. Back then, he gave away all of his potentials to grow just to regain his emotions. Sure, it was torture to live without them, but I could just wait, grow more and regain them later, he thought, unable to forgive himself for the past mistakes. But what's important right now is to not make any mistakes down the line, Matthew thought, raising his eyes and looking at the officer with a sense of urgency burning behind his eyes. I don't even want to know what plan you have in store, the negotiator only shook his head, making his mustache jump around as a result. But I say we go for efficiency, he decided only to rest his free arm on his hip. His right hand, though, continued to tighten around the handle of the man's gun. All right, Matthew nodded his head only to then proceed to shake it. What are you doing? The policeman asked, weirded out by Matt's sudden movements. Shaking off all the unnecessary thoughts, Matthew replied, bringing his head back up and then taking a deep breath. Let's do it, he added after just a short moment. There was no time for hesitation. It doesn't matter if my actions will turn me into a devil, Matthew thought, the look in his eyes darkening as he picked up the pace and led the group down the corridor. The school was relatively small. The object of Matthew's interest was just right ahead. I hope you left someone to guard Nadia, Matthew muttered under his nose as he approached the doors. Yeah, the middle-aged officer nodded his head in response. There are 2 gunmen with her, she will be safe, he explained. The power balance between those 2 changed greatly over the course of just the last few minutes. From the adult and the freaking out kid to partners who each recognized the other's value. Matthew, despite not having any military or disciplinary upbringing, could recognize the discipline and prowess of a trained man. On the other hand, the officer could see the same type of determination that he experienced only on the battlefield before. It was a weird pairing, but one that worked out surprisingly well. What is this place? The officer asked when Matthew led the forward part of the group inside a small room, cramped with big boxes full of electrical equipment. It's the school's radio station, Matthew smiled as he approached the desk and picked up the mic haphazardly thrown in the corner by the previous shift of the radio club. How was it? Matthew muttered as he played around with the switches and controls of the system. He would glance once every few moments towards the clock, watching with desperation as it continued to tick down. Okay, I'm all set, Matthew purred before turning his eyes towards the officer. Go and alert the others. We need to occupy the rooftop and the highest floor of the school, Matthew ordered, only to turn his lips back towards the microphone and press the main switch of the system. To all students. Our school will now go through the surprise fire drill. Matthew announced into the microphone. In an instant, his voice filled every corner and corridor of the school. And before he could even make any follow-up, the entire place started to shake when all the students started to move at once. A fire drill in the exam period was truly a God-sent, a gift that not a single one of them would pass on. All students are to calmly assemble in the courtyard of the school and wait for further instructions. Matthew added only to flick the switch again and throw the microphone away. Hey, the officer shouted, grabbing Matthew's arm as he turned around with the clear intention of leaving the room. What was that all about? He asked, clearly unhappy with Matthew making big moves without consulting them with the police beforehand. Controlling those 2 places is crucial to our survival, Matthew explained with a blank, passive voice. There wasn't even a single emotion in it. Why didn't you pull the students just from those 2 floors then? The officer shouted, clearly enraged by Matthew's autonomous actions. BL.net, or rather, not the actions themselves, but the insane burden that would fall on all of them as a result. If people will turn randomly, then we can't stop the culling. It will happen, whether everyone is at school or in the courtyard. Matthew shook his arms, a strange, dark spirit appearing in the back of his eyes. He survived 2 weeks into the apocalypse. He saw a countless number of students, hot girls, kind and oppressive guys alike. All of them eaten. All of them turned into gory sights. What good does amazing them all on the courtyard do? Then the officer still protested, unable to agree with Matthew's approach. For them? Matthew asked, nodding his head towards the doors where people were starting to rush towards the exit. Given how excited they were, it would take a long while before anyone would notice the pile of corpses down the corridor. It changes nothing, Matthew revealed without any hesitation. And most of the students and teachers in this school simply failed to get a piece of it. But it gives us more time to prepare. Matthew finally revealed the true reason behind his actions. And well, if we only evacuated the top 2 floors, he then added, a wicked smile appearing on his face as he approached the doors. Wouldn't that alert someone, leading to the panic and paralyzing our ability to buy ourselves some time?